Welcome back to Listen and Be Heard, Sherrie Flick. I'm so glad to have you here today in the audio garden.
It's so great to be here.
Here has actually changed. I think you're a visiting professor at UC Davidson. Is that right?
Yeah, Davidson College.
Davidson
Yeah.
College.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm here for the spring semester for 6 months. So new place, little apartment on campus. Yeah, it's nice.
A little further south, maybe an hour or two from where WLBH is here in Greenville, South Carolina. And
In the,
you're visiting us again because you have a new book coming out. Last time it was the book of essays. Um, uh, uh, oh gosh.
homing
Homing
instincts of a
instincts,
Rust Belt.
thank you, of a Rust Belt feminist. I had that part. I forgot the first part. And now it's a book of short stories called I Have Not Considered Consequences.
Yes.
And I finished reading it this week. Some of them are very short stories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe we could start out talking about. I think you've written a lot of short stories, and many have been published in various magazines and reviews and so on. What is it that appeals to you about the form of short stories, or even I think some of these could be called flash fiction?
Yeah, definitely. I've been a huge fan of flash fiction for most of my career. I started writing flash fiction in the late 80s. And for a whole decade, it was the only thing that I wrote. I was very adamant about writing stories under 1,000 words. It was my soapbox that I was on for a while.
And was there a particular reason for being so adamant, or it was just something that you're attracted to?
I liked the experimentation. I liked the compression of the stories, what the silences, what could be left out, the challenge. A bunch of people at that time were pushing back against more traditional story forms, and I think I was just sort of part of that movement. I didn't necessarily know that at the time, but
Uh-huh.
there were a lot of people, Joy Williams and Diane Williams and Amy Hempel and different writers publishing these short pieces that really resonated with me. And so that was sort of my challenge for a really long time. It's sort of my default length. I think most of my stories, if I didn't try to make them longer, would be about 750 words. That's my sweet spot for whatever reason. But I've also enjoyed the challenge of trying to write longer stories, of trying to
Uh-huh.
sort of extend and push against, what was once my adamant belief that only stories should, be that long. So this collection has a wide range of stories, from stories that are about 75 words to stories that are, I don't know, 20 pages, 15 to 20 pages.
Yes. Was there one that was actually 20 pages? I'm not sure.
I don't know if it got that long.
I'll
I
take
haven't
your
actually,
word for that.
as I was saying it, I was like, I actually haven't counted how long the long stories
Uh-huh.
are, but they're over 10.
So for people who have a hard time with novels or something like that, it's a nice way to maybe dip in and just read a story, put it down, come back later, get another
Yeah.
story. Um,
Take it on the bus with you, the subway, the airplane. Yeah.
so I have not considered consequences, not the consequences, but just consequences.
Right. Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
is that a theme? I think it's a theme that kind of ties these stories together. There's sort of a refrain where you say, well, later on this is going to happen, but they don't know that now, or they weren't thinking about this now. And that kind of seems to fall in with not considering consequences. So, what is it about that that resonates for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because originally, the whole time I was writing the manuscript, and even after I sent it into the publisher, I thought the title was going to be Breaking, which is the title of the first story.
Hmm.
And then no one liked that title, except for me. I don't even know if I ended up liking the title. It was sort of a default title. So when we started looking deeper into the stories, this idea of consequences and the fact that in the first story, the character actually says, I never consider consequences, really does tie together the stories, the women characters in the stories in particular. It also kind of resonates with the flash fiction form in that there's a kind of, with the compression of flash fiction, you're dependent on the reader to fill in a lot of information. And so I think
Mm.
sometimes the reader is actually anticipating consequences that aren't in the story. So that's kind of fun to play with it form-wise as well.
Uh-huh. Interesting because I guess I did find myself doing that a bit, but so then I was actually considering the consequences as opposed to not considering them.
Right. You were watching the characters not consider consequences as you considered the consequences for them, right?
Right, right. And I guess you're right. I hadn't thought about that, but in flash fiction, that's almost what you're expecting of a reader because you're really not putting a whole lot of detail necessarily in order to keep it short.
Yeah, there's a kind of compression that opens up with the reading. And it's interesting because sometimes a person will have read my story on the page or they've heard me read a story out loud and they'll say, oh, wait, I thought that story was so much longer, because they've sort of worked with me to kind of create the bigger picture. And I think that's part of the challenge of a person who's interested in writing flash fiction is there's a kind of suggestion that isn't vague. You aren't being vague or undetailed. You're just placing markers in the text so that they kind of expand as the reader reads. And that's really fun challenge.
Well, it was a challenge as a reader, and I think it did kind of engage me maybe more in the reading of it as opposed to maybe like watching a movie where you're just kind of carried along. This kind of requires you to participate in a story when you have to reach for some of those details and kind of make them up yourself, I guess.
Yeah, you make like sort of complementary details to what's in the story, I think.
So, can we talk about the bear?
Sure.
The bear. The bear keeps showing up. I didn't count how many bear stories are in here, but they're sort of peppered through the whole book. Um, and he's kind of a mystery. In one of the stories, he's actually a man in a bear costume, which
Yes.
made me kind of go back and like rethink some of the original story. Oh, well, maybe that explains it, that that was like actually a man and not a bear in a costume. But so, how does the bear operate for you in your like your concept of this book and as a metaphor, I guess?
Yes. Yeah, so the collection has a bear on the cover dancing with a woman there.
Yes.
And the bear stories came to me during the pandemic.
Mm.
The bear ended up being this super weird muse that I just started writing these stories. And I wasn't really thinking of them in the sense of a collection. They were just kind of me processing this weird world that I'm suddenly living in that doesn't make any sense. And so once I put them together, I started seeing kind of conversations between the bears. It isn't one bear. People have asked me that, is it the same bear through the stories? And it isn't. It's kind of bearness or a muse, the idea of unlikely situations. Again, I guess that ties into consequences. But I was able to fully inhabit this bear. Every time I wrote these stories, it was not a challenge in any way whatsoever to kind of be in the bear's head, whether it's a home inspector wearing a bear suit, or it's a bear who's bartending, or it's a bear who's a mid-level professional. There was the absurdity of the story became complete logic for me within the text. And that
Hmm.
was a joy, really, to write and to work on. And so once I put them all together, I was like, oh, wow, I could have a collection here, but they are not going to be all bear stories. So then I started writing these longer stories and other stories to fit in, so that the bear stories are a thread through the whole
So
book. The
the
book
bear
begins and
came
ends.
first.
The bear came first.
Uh-huh.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, those were all pandemic stories. And then all the
That's
other stories came after.
that's kind of a writer's thing. Like here we are 5 years later, and it's like we as writers digest these things, and then it takes
Right.
time for them to come out in print. And so here we are 5 years later, I think getting COVID stories from many different
Yeah.
sources that are finally kind of both been processed and by the writer and then published as well. So that's
Right.
very interesting. I did find also um, like I kind of wanted to identify with the bear a bit. And maybe it was a lady bear sometimes. Even though I don't know why I tend to assume bears are male, or we think of them as like this big, fierce
They're kind
male
of
kind of
macho.
symbol, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I thought, I can see Sherry's bear nature like that. That kind of fits, although maybe I shouldn't make it personal like that.
Yeah, there is a kind of bear as muse. It's really interesting because as I told my friends I was writing these bear stories, they would just send these really interesting bear memes, bear facts, bear videos, whatever. I was just getting all of this bear information. That I don't know, it ended up just encouraging me really to like, oh, right, I see how like this bear muse is really, it's connecting me to my friends, it's connecting me to like my creativity. And I do see, like you said, right now, I see a lot of COVID inspired work coming out in books. Like this is the amount of time I think it took for it to get, to the market. So I think there's going to be a lot of weird and experimental work coming out that is hopefully exciting and just pushing out some norms.
Well, I think that this might fit into the category of experimental in several different ways. Um, I think also there's sort of a theme of relationships between men and women, between brothers and sisters, parents, and how they kind of affect the way we behave as adults a lot of the time. Um, and also, though, this kind of I don't want to say academia, but sort of the life around academia, whether it's like bartending while you're going to school or being part of this kind of, uh, world of intellectuals who are kind of existing almost, I don't want to say in an ivory tower, but it had me contemplating, especially in like today's climate, political climate, um, how you perceive that and how maybe that's changed in people's lives, how they perceive themselves within this academic world that they're learning to kind of navigate and sometimes seem to dislike. Maybe I'm reading that wrong. I don't know.
Well, right. It's new territory for me to a degree, looking at intellectuals, domestic scenes of intellectuals and art professionals, and a different kind of world than I'm usually a little grittier in
Right.
the
Your
world.
essays were based more the book of Rust Belt feminism. It was kind of you talked about your days in baking
Right.
and the kind of working class Pittsburgh thing. Um, so I guess so. I hadn't thought about it that way. It's a bit of a departure, and yet a lot of your characters are kind of struggling with, well, I used to be in this band and I thought I was going to be a rock star or something, and but now I'm doing this and kind of learning to be adults in a way.
Yeah, I think the characters in general are not necessarily super comfortable in these worlds that they've chosen. There's a whole story that centers around reading Edith Wharton, which is, I don't know where that came from, but and that's where the grad student comes in, and there's this whole intellectual discussion, but there's also a kind of unease within it, like what are we supposed to be doing, and how are we supposed to be talking? And I think that's the other side of me, right? I grew up, if we're gonna like start merging books together, I grew up in a mill town. I was a baker, hung out with artists and musicians, but I'm teaching. Eventually, I was an arts museum professional, and then I, started teaching in academia. So, and I'm not, necessarily comfortable in those worlds either. And so, part of it was like looking at that tension of how do you operate in a space that is itself uncomfortable, often purposely uncomfortable, and exclusive. So I wasn't so much considering it, but considering it through my characters, putting them in these situations and seeing what would happen. I worked in a museum for 7 years. I worked at the Frick Art and Historical Center here in Pittsburgh, and I've never written in any way about it, really. Like, there's so much detail that I knew about, like, the backside of museum work. And I was feeling like, wow, I should just use some of that, in a story and see what happens. So that was really fun to just kind of, I have different expertise that I just haven't explored, I guess. And so this was an opportunity. I mean, I already had the bears in there, so, anything could go.
Yes, yes, anything could. I have to say that that particular story of the art world, you had a character who was reaching out, tried to have a date, and it turned out to be sort of something that everyone at both offices consulted about. And that was really kind of a poignant story of that kind of happened played out in different ways in a lot of your stories where it's just a something that could have happened or might have happened, but maybe they didn't consider consequences and like what might
Right.
have happened didn't happen.
Yeah, there could have been an easy ending, but the easy ending doesn't happen. Like, their
Right.
conflict steps in. Yeah, for sure.
And I think also there's this tension in trying to understand like adult relationships between men and women. I think it could apply to any type of relationship, but these are sort of binary stories.
Hmm.
And how much of that is, sort of another feminist point of view? You talked about Rust Belt feminism in your essays. And I think here it's almost like the men and the women, they're not quite sure how to have a relationship in these modern times. Do you think that strikes true, or am I?
Yeah, I do. I think, I often am writing about independent women who are in and out of relationships, but struggling, but struggling with both of those things. How does independence, unroll within a relationship, and that tension and the fallout, and just trying to communicate, the idea that, I always talk to my students about, when you're writing dialogue, for it to sound real, you have to realize that half the time people are not listening to what anyone is saying. And so dialogue is like two different stories kind of coming at each other.
Mm,
And I do like to explore that, again, like these missed opportunities, like someone says something and someone else mishears it. And, how does that affect a relationship? Yeah, I think that fits right. What you were saying fits right into some of my goals for these characters, for sure.
so to speak about process for a moment, you do have goals for your characters then.
Do I? Yeah, I think I just said that, didn't
You did, and
I?
I'd like you to expound on that a little bit, if you could, maybe as you would with your students at in your classes. Like,
Um,
what does that mean to have a goal for your characters?
well, how I talk about it sometimes in class is I think every character should have a secret. And I think that the author should know the secret. And that's what pushes the character forward. But the secret doesn't necessarily need to be revealed in the story, right? Because that's kind of how we are in the world. We're walking through the world. People don't know us, they only know how we act. And so I try to really mimic that interior, exterior tension. I'm very interested in that with setting, interior setting versus exterior setting, with people, interior kind of thoughts and tension versus exterior actions. And so part of it, I guess, when I'm drafting is I'm really thinking in that way. I'm thinking of all the things I just said to you, and I'm trying to get something onto the page. And then I think, in revision, which is where I think the real writing happens, in, revision 5, you start thinking, okay, what do I want for this character? Now that I have this whole world kind of built, how can I really form this so it becomes a meaningful story? Does that make sense? So it's a long process, but I do kind of start with these opposite tensions. I'm building that as I go, and then I'm forming it later to be, kind of have more depth.
So you write in layers, I'm hearing. So is
Oh,
a
for
fifth
sure.
revision kind of normal, or does it go
Yeah.
further than that?
Yeah.
Or
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's just endless. I'm sure in this book I'll be marking things at readings that I don't want to say again. It never ends.
I see.
Yeah, I've like I draft really quickly. I'll just sit down and
Let it
dump out a
flow.
story, write out a story, and then I look at it, and then the real work begins. So I'm not really beholden to what I've put on the page. I'm just roughly trying to get ideas out there through characters. I was just at a conference, and John Dufresne was on my panel, and the last thing he said to the audience was, don't worry about the first sentences that you draft because they won't be there in the end. And I thought that was so great because it's so true. I mean, if you went back and looked from your very first draft to the final story, so many of those words and sentences are completely gone because they were stand-in, or they were expanded upon, or they were sloppy in them. So yeah, layering many drafts. That's definitely part of big
So
part
it's
of the
not a spontaneous craft for you. Well, and
no.
although I guess it starts with spontaneity, right?
Yes.
And kind of develops from there.
And I hope when
So
it's read on the page, it seems, fluid, in the sense it's, you want the story to unravel. So like, it's, it's a very easy story in that sense, but yeah.
well, this collection is out on Autumn House Press, right? Did I get
Yes.
that right? Yes, Autumn House Press. I have not considered Consequences by Sherrie Flick. Is there anything you would like to tell our audience about the book, or that I haven't really asked you about, or something that you would like people to get from it?
I think it's funny in parts. I think we've been talking a lot about tension and consequences and struggle, but there's also, some lighthearted bareness
Yes,
to it.
there's actually quite a lot of humor in it. So if I overlooked that, I
I did
apologize
too. I
because
was
it's
just thinking like,
absolutely
oh
true.
wait, we went this other way, but it's actually funny in parts.
And will you be making some appearances to read from it?
Yes, I'm reading in Asheville in May, and I can't remember the date of the reading, at Malaprop's bookstore. And
Okay, you can text it to me later, and I'll be sure
okay,
to put it on the website.
I'll text
I
that to
will
you.
also be reading in Nashville in May at the Flood Gallery, so maybe
Maybe
we
it's the
can
same
exchange
day.
that information. Who knows?
Yeah,
That
that
would
would
be
be
fun if it
awesome.
was. If I could put you on the spot, I would like to give you 3 prompts
Oh
and
dear.
just tell me whatever comes to mind.
Okay.
I do this with all our guests, so maybe I didn't do it with you last time, but I started doing it since then. So the first thing is, and you could tell me about this either where you are now or in Pittsburgh, but Have you had any books banned of your own? And what's going on with book banning where you are? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I don't believe I've had any books banned, although my essay collection has the word feminist in the title, and I believe that is one of the banned words, but I haven't heard of any banning of my own books. I will say here in Davidson, the bookstore, Main Street Books, has a whole giant banned book section. They're just like really going at it and doing a great job of just exposing these books that people are trying to suppress. So great shout out to them.
Well, that's good to hear. And listen and be heard. That's a prompt.
Oh, right, listen and be heard. I think it's time right now to listen to artists really in a lot of ways, and support artists and try to, I don't know, give people space to talk, and to be heard. I feel like now is the time that we really, really need to create community and embrace that.
Thank you. And one more prompt.
Okay.
We the people.
We the people. Yeah, I think
this is a new prompt. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
it's a new one.
Off the top of your head. I think again, the idea of joining together, the idea of thinking about different kinds of unity and different kinds of creative unity. I don't think everybody wants to or can protest, but everybody can think of ways to, push forward more progressive ideas.
Well, thank you, Sherrie Flick, very much for your ideas and your thoughts, and for your book of short and very short stories, I Have Not Considered Consequences. Thank you so much for joining me here in the audio garden.
Thanks, Martha. It's been great.